Hi guys, we're doing another screencast today, and I just want to remind you that as you watch and listen, I'll be pointing out some of the things that are important to remember for our lessons coming up, and you need to make sure that you're following along with the notes and taking the appropriate notes. So we're starting today with Christopher Columbus, which I guess is fitting because I'm recording this on Columbus Day. As you can see in the notes here, it says that he's an Italian explorer, but he is financed and supported by Spain. And that's pretty significant because Spain had just recently finished with its Reconquista, which is when it kind of reconquered the Iberian Peninsula after it had been taken over by some of the Islamic caliphates. This is a time period of a lot of religious tension in Spain, and that's going to be one of the many reasons why they want to expand. Along with spreading Christianity, the second reason why Spain would like to expand at this time period is to compete economically with Portugal. Portugal had already, as you guys learned, made its way into the Indian Ocean and the Indian Ocean trade by traveling around the southern tip of Africa. Spain also wants to get in that market, but Columbus, of course, decides that instead of going around Africa, he's going to sail west and sail across the Atlantic Ocean. There's a lot of stories as to why this is. He's not the first person to figure out that the Earth is round, and yes, it is round. But he does decide that the fastest route to Asia is going to be the one across the Atlantic. Of course, we all know that instead of getting to Asia, the East Indies, as he had thought, he actually reaches the Caribbean. And on his first of 5 different voyages, he travels to several different islands. And this one he's just trying to explore, but he comes back, like I said, 5 more times, and he'll come back the later times to colonize. Later, as you can see, the Portuguese also traveled west, and they believed they too had reached Asia and claimed some parts of the land for Portugal. And that's why today we have Brazil, one of the largest countries in South America, that is a Portuguese-speaking country, because that large portion of South America was claimed for Portugal. The Treaty of Tordesillas was sponsored by Pope Alexander VI as a way to stop tension between Spain and Portugal. It's a little bit of one of these things where Europeans will go into someone else's territory and decide that they're the only ones who have a right to that land. In the Treaty of Tordesillas, basically what happens is the Pope draws a line across the world and divides the western half, giving it all to Spain, and the eastern half, giving it all to Portugal, which of course doesn't account for all the other people in the world, as well as the Native Americans who are already in these places in the quote-unquote New World. Brazil, as you can see, does have some territory west of the line, but of course, the part east of it makes sure that that is a Portuguese claim. So if you move on, one of the things we're going to skip here is Indian Ocean trade because we've already talked about this. We did our map activity on that. Again, the point we want to emphasize here is that Europeans entering into this overseas trade is going to change that when it comes to technology, the type of goods that are there, and of course, the introduction of European culture and Christianity. A couple of things I want to emphasize with China. We talked about how the Chinese, although they do see some similarities between Christianity and Confucianism, as you see down here, are by and large going to reject most of European technology. We see some things coming in, of course. There's advancements in Europe in optics, guns. They're going to take the Chinese gunpowder and turn it into weapons of destruction. And that's going to completely change the nature of warfare. But for the most part, it's the foreign merchants who desired business with the Chinese. And they're going to have to work very hard to try to make that happen. The Chinese are going to restrict trade as much as possible. And we're going to see that tension between the Chinese and the Europeans continue throughout this course, especially as we go into the 20th century. One of the things we didn't really talk about a lot was the voyage of Zheng He, spelled Zhang He, of course. This is a voyage that predates 7 different voyages. You just saw a little bit in the Indian Ocean map, but it predates Christopher Columbus. And in the background, you can kind of see it. It's showing a picture of the ships that he had in his fleet. It talks about how these treasure ships were over 400 feet long, had 27,000 men on it. They're about 10 times the size of what Columbus sailed across the ocean. So although we're kind of talking about European technology being better during the 15th, 16th century, there's still some things about what China had and what India had in the past that was superior to it. And I want to emphasize that because it's important to note this is not just the story of some civilization that is greater than everybody else, being the Europeans. It's a civilization that learned from the Chinese, the Indians, even people in the Americas eventually, and adapts things to their advantage, which is something that's going to help them move into a place of relative superiority later on in the history we're going to study. The Japanese, as we studied, also rejected trade, especially with Portuguese merchants, because as you can see here, one of the big things that caused tension is the introduction of Christianity. By 1637, all Christian merchants are kicked out, and anybody who was Japanese who converted to Christianity was either executed or forced to convert back to Buddhism. Japanese will enter into a period of relative isolation, except, of course, they did trade with the Dutch because the Dutch took their shoes off. So Japan emerges during this time period as being a place that has a feudal society. And the big kind of context that we need to know and understand about Japan at the time is one of the reasons for its isolation is, of course, the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate. Tokugawa Ieyasu is the last of many kind of stronger warlords who emerged from this warring states time period. And the reason why they're so worried about the emergence of European trade is they're concerned that European goods could be used to turn the tide against them. And they could lose their power. We're going to learn a lot more about Tokugawa Ieyasu and how the Japanese society works in the absolutist section, which is coming up in a few weeks because it fits better into that section. Some of this stuff is not in the notes, but I did want to give you guys some background on Spanish colonization and conquest. So don't worry about it if you don't see this stuff pop up in the notes. So Columbus's first voyage, of course, is 1492. But in September of 1493, he makes his second voyage, and this time he's coming to colonize America, not just explore. Colonies are lands outside of a country that are now under the control of another nation. So, for example, large parts of South and Central America will fall under Spanish rule, even though there are people there, Native Americans. The territory is still going to be nominally under the control of the Spanish. Over the next 200 years, as you guys learned about in U.S. history, Spain, Portugal, France, England, and even the Netherlands and Sweden will colonize large portions of America. And it's the kind of origin story for most American countries today, including our country. So if you look at the 18th century map of European colonization, you can see that the English, kind of the ancestors of our country, established 13 colonies and territory in Canada. The French are going to move across Canada and Mississippi River, claim territory here. Spain basically grabs everything else except for Brazil. We're going to talk about these territories in the Caribbean later on this unit because these islands become massive sugar producers. Sugar becomes the most popular cash crop, but also the most important cash crop when it comes to the Atlantic slave trade. Of course, there's a whole lot of people already living in America when Europeans colonized it. So we got to talk about them. The big thing we're going to talk about is interaction between Europeans and Native Americans, and then interaction between Europeans and African slaves they bring over. But before we get into that, we have to really understand, well, what were the Native Americans like beforehand? There were millions of people living in America, the indigenous people, the native people, or sometimes they go by Indians, even though that's a misnomer. It's not really what they should be called. One of the largest empires is the Aztec Empire, and their story of conquest and eventual fall to a small army of Spanish soldiers is pretty important. Because it marks one of the first times that a major American civilization falls to European powers.